Welcome back to another episode of the Beyond Motion podcast. My name is Zach Scarano,
And I am Lindsey Hennington.
and we are talking ergonomics today. An interesting topic for us in our business, a market that we're trying to pursue a bit more heavily. I think that there's been, some historic applications for our company in this area, but it was pretty undefined. And I think, nowadays we're seeing a bit more of a heavier push into that intersection between biomechanics and how it's being applied, I think, day to day in like the ergonomics and human factors industries. Um, so probably just to start, when you first heard the term ergonomics and human factors, what did you picture?
Like when I first heard about it a long time ago, like it's all,
It was second grade.
yeah, second grade. Yeah. I like chairs and mice,
Yeah.
basically. It's like it was all about like ergonomic posture
Mm.
kind of thing, or like sitting at a desk. So it was more like an adjective you applied to some thing that you're using, right? Like an ergonomic mouse, an ergonomic
Yeah.
chair.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think that's probably our first exposure to it from the standpoint, particularly, yeah, like keyboards, mice. But then you start to think about product design in
Mm-hmm.
general. But at what point did it sort of cross over for you, I guess, working at Naraxon, where you're like, oh, like ergonomics in terms of occupational health, work safety, work environments, and then even into some of the, let's say, deeper areas with like digital human modeling and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, just with everything you mentioned is like I didn't even know a lot of those things were ergonomics
Mhm.
prior to working here, just because like product design is kind of the obvious thing. Um, you know, you kind of associate ergonomics with efficiency
Mm.
or like optimization, right? But it's hard to know how far that goes until you get specific examples. So, like looking at the efficiency, something could be designed more efficiently, and that could be either a thing, a product, it could be a workflow, it could be a
Mm.
way of doing things. And then like using technology to understand those things. It feels very similar to the way our clinical users use products or the way like clinicians utilize technology in
Mhm.
general. It's like you're doing it for a purpose. You're trying to heal someone, you're trying to help them recover, you're trying to help them improve performance. And
Mhm.
ergonomists, to me, really feel like they're kind of working to improve a process rather than a person necessarily.
Yeah, I
Not as a rule, but
sure, generally speaking. No,
yeah.
that makes sense. And I think just the same as those users or, clinicians or people in sort of these other applied areas, uh, they're trying to find answers to a question and they're measuring it in order to maybe verify or validate an instinctual answer that they've already got. And I think, at this point in time, the technology is sort of allowing those measurements to maybe come by a little bit easier or maybe with a
Sure.
little bit more objectivity. Uh, but I think from at least my understanding of this space is that they've been measuring things forever.
Oh
This is
yeah.
this is decades of work that have been done to produce, occupational health standards or,
Hmm.
certain design standards or what have you.
Yeah, the field of
Um,
ergonomics is not new to technology, that's
right.
for sure. And it kind of it feels like it is newer to clinicians. Like it's this almost brave new world of
Mm.
like physical therapists, for instance, doing measurements manually and trying to make these connections. But yeah, you're right. Ergonomists have been using stuff like that forever and have developed these tools that are, let's say it, assessments based
Mhm.
on the utilization of those tools.
Yeah.
Like, uh, the assessments even that we provide in our software, like the NIOSH lifting equation, RULA, REBA, things like that.
Yeah, I wonder if that's like because, there's although like an ergonomist in terms of like somebody who's a practitioner, for a manufacturer, let's say, like they're not necessarily a trained clinician, but there seems to be this crossover between people in clinical medicine who may be, physical therapists or athletic trainers that find their way into the occupational health side of things.
Totally.
So they kind of bring that knowledge base with them. And, at the end of the day, I mean, you're evaluating somebody's movement capacity or performance capacity.
Hmm.
And so like the sort of methodology is the same. I think what changes is just like why you're doing it. Is it to heal somebody from an injury? Or is it, as you mentioned, to like increase and optimize efficiency within a workflow?
Hmm.
And probably both of those things you can wrap up into either one of those territories, either in
Sure.
clinical medicine or occupational health or ergonomics or, whichever you want to call it. Um, but I think what's interesting is how they both areas really have had this like set of standard tests that they've always used or have used for a long time rather
For sure.
for that evaluation and maybe what we're seeing kind of in more modern times is how technology assists with that and adds that objective layer that otherwise was not there from a precision standpoint, because
Correct.
I mean, the idea I think with these tests and things is that they are providing some objective information, but maybe it's based off of subjective measures.
Correct. Yeah. So it is more so about precision
Hmm.
and, getting repeatable results over time to make sure that what you're looking at is what you think you're looking at, more
Yeah.
or less.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, I think it kind of starts to open up the question about like what level of precision is necessary. And I know that's something that we sort of wrestle with all the time in any of these application areas because you really are trying to bridge the gap, let's say, like between usability and performance and accuracy and
Yeah.
cost. And, you have all these sort of limiting factors that, either are going to make a tool very usable or sort of usable or very accurate or sort of accurate.
Yeah.
Sometimes they seem to be combative against each other, but I think that's what's most interesting about some of the work that we do is like, okay, how do we bring our tools, which of course have been sort of perfected or designed with a research lab in mind,
Hmm.
into these more practical areas.
Yeah. And it is kind of, it's funny having our hands in both sides. And we talked about this during our conversation about 3D motion capture
Mm,
and 2D motion capture is that there's this give and take between, okay, research grade typically means like you need things to be as accurate as possible. But when you give someone to a tool to someone who is more so in that applied field, whether they're a clinician, maybe an ergonomist, they're willing to forgive
mm,
some level of accuracy in the interest of having that tool be more usable for their needs.
yeah.
Whether that's like it needs to do the same thing every time, it needs to be faster, it needs to be more efficient workflow wise to get through some sort of data capture. And that's what's interesting, right? Because those things are like shouldn't be on their own, right? Something should be able to be both user friendly and accurate.
Hmm.
But in order to get a better level of accuracy, like it often involves like standardization, it
Hmm.
involves more rigorous calibration methods and things like that. Anyway, kind of a recap of our conversation before, so don't have to get too far in the weeds there, but it's just funny how much of a similarity you can find between those avenues when you get down to it as well, and especially in ergonomics, because ergonomics research and ergonomics in the field feel like they're more similar
Hmm.
than research versus like using something as a clinical tool.
Interesting. Yeah, I was actually maybe gonna say kind of the opposite thing to that, just because
Oh, let's have a debate.
yeah. From the standpoint of from what I understand and what I've learned, over the years is that there's kind of two camps of ergonomics. You have like proactive ergonomics, which seems to be born in these research labs, or at least in like very controlled settings. And that seems to be where like the precision and the accuracy
Hmm.
is paramount, because ultimately they're trying to make decisions about something that doesn't exist physically yet. And then you have the reactive ergonomics, which is probably the more, I guess, like the longer history of ergonomics when it comes to like applied ergonomics,
Sure.
where they're responding to situations where a certain work environment has yielded a number of injuries or something like that,
Hmm.
or inefficiencies, uh, and so I think like from that standpoint, the practicality, like the practitioner's version of ergonomics, is a little bit different than the sort of lab-based ergonomics research from that end. Now, I think there is even a similar connection then to that other side of the world into sort of more like human movement from the standpoint of rehab,
Hmm.
where you kind of have a similar thing, but the rather that there's not such thing as like proactive rehab. I mean, like, it's in the prefix of the word, right? It's rehab. It's,
Right.
not prohab or prehab. And so they tend to be responding to a situation. Somebody tears the ACL,
Hmm.
now they're in rehab and they're trying to build that back. However, and something that we see a lot, right, is a lot of our users are also doing measures for performance reasons. So
Hmm.
that in a way is kind of like the proactive side of things where they're trying to
Right.
like mitigate injuries in addition to, building up performance. And I feel like that is very similar to what we see in this ergonomic space, but just to a different end, right? It's not to go and win a championship or something like that, right? But it's to, ensure the health and safety of your workforce, or maybe, overall usability and comfort and safety of consumers who might be using your products or something.
Sure. Yeah. Um, and I wouldn't say they're necessarily exclusive. I wouldn't
Hmm.
say ergonomics is more so about long-term health and safety, whereas rehab isn't.
Right.
Overall, the goal of whoever is guiding you through a rehab program as a physical therapist or whoever you're working with is long-term getting better, you
Sure.
know? Um, but it is I the juxtaposition between those two is not lost on me. It's kind of interesting to um just think about, I don't know, how when you're designing something as more ergonomic, more efficient, more safe, like you have different guide rails on
Mhm.
you when you're depending in comparison to if you're doing some kind of rehab program.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting to me thinking about the difference in these users, right? Clinical users versus ergonomists, for instance. Clinical users know a lot about like the human body. They know a lot about how to get someone better because that's what they've been trained to do. They've
Hmm.
gone to medical school or physical therapy school. Ergonomists can come from a variety of different backgrounds.
Hmm.
Sometimes they've gone to some kind of medical training. A lot of them are like kinesiology majors that
Yeah.
end up going into like biomechanics afterwards. So I feel they have an interesting, like more well-rounded understanding of like how the body should move in specific like joint positions when
Hmm.
you're talking about motion capture specifically with ergonomics.
Yeah, and maybe there's a little bit more of an engineering slant
Yes.
in ergonomics or people that are in the ergonomics industry versus, people in the clinical industry, right? Like you said, they've got expertise in the human body, but not every one of them, and probably the majority of them, don't necessarily look at the human body from the principles of engineering,
Hmm.
where that may be the lens that these ergonomics and human factors engineers are tending to see things from. So it's like they see the problem and then their solution is derived from the engineering principles, looking at all of the different independent and dependent variables and how do
Right.
they tweak this, that, or the other thing. Whereas, yeah, maybe the clinician is more wholly focused on like the body itself.
Yeah. Like it feels more physics to me, right?
Sure.
Like looking at, for instance, like the NIOSH applications manual, like
Yeah.
explaining how you're looking at the lifting equation and what parameters go into it, like the distance something is away from you horizontally and vertically, and using center of mass as sort of that reference point. Like it's all just like what's it called? A free body diagram.
Yeah.
Basically, it's all
Yeah.
it's like 100% physics, right?
Yeah.
Um, Not 100%, obviously, but like it, as you mentioned, it feels very engineering. It feels very scientific. Whereas if we're comparing assessments, right, like an
Hmm.
ergonomics assessment might be the NIOSH lifting equation, a clinical assessment might be something like the modified CAT-SIB balance
Hmm.
test, right? That feels like, you might be looking for certain things during that test. You might be looking at like how the body reacts to being on an unstable surface or
Hmm.
standing on one leg or your eyes being open or closed, but you're not so much concerned about like exact positioning of the body,
Hmm.
just kind of are you more or less stable than before
Yeah.
kind of thing. It's a little more subjective.
Yeah, and I think another area that's interesting too with that, and maybe why it has to be more of this physical interaction, is because in ergonomics, that's primarily what they're analyzing is like somebody's interaction with the physical world,
Yeah,
versus again on the maybe the rehab side of things, it's just like what's going on inside of your body and how can we affect that by, giving you some sort of prescription, therapy prescription.
right.
And so you're sort of using the tool set, let's say, like internally to then make that change in that rehabilitation scenario versus in the ergonomics scenario, it's like you still need to be able to move this material, but how can we make it so that it doesn't, break your back after you do it for 5 years or something like that?
Yeah, right.
So there's this requirement that you are having to relate the interaction with the physical world to the body versus just like let's fix your body.
Yeah.
Um, so it's interesting. I think that that's probably why you see some of these people who, maybe they have a clinical training to an extent,
Hmm.
but they tend to come to the table with more of that like technical training,
Right.
and then kind of merging those two things together.
Which I mean, I think is awesome because we
Yeah, that's
majored in
like
engineering.
exactly. That's like right
It's
up
like
our
we've
alley.
learned
Yeah.
everything that we learned about like physical therapy and rehab from working here and
Mhm.
interacting with our customers, basically. Not because we went to physical therapy school and know what you should do when you
Yeah.
get injured. So I think it creates this interesting sort of merging between like, okay, these people have this engineering slant, these
Hmm.
ergonomists have an engineering slant, but they come to the table with like a really holistic knowledge of how movement should happen and what feels safe versus not safe,
Yeah.
and can apply that to more, focused thresholds, let's say, than maybe a clinician who, and again, it's not black and white, right? But it feels to me that, that's the case more often,
Yeah.
where they have more of that focus, whereas a clinician is working with a patient and they might be going off of numbers sometimes, but at the end of the day, every time I've been to physical therapy, like it's just kind of like, are you feeling better?
Right. Yeah. Does
Are
it
you getting
hurt?
stronger?
Yeah.
Does it hurt anymore?
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know, it's two different ends for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Had I think it's interesting too, being, coming from engineering school and everything. It's like we didn't that was never an avenue that was ever described, and maybe
No,
that's
not
just
to me.
because coming from like biomedical engineering specifically, because
hmm
I know that the engineers that tend to fall to the ergonomic space maybe come more from the mechanical side of things. But it feels like, again, it's like unless you're doing product design completely, which makes sense from a mechanical engineering standpoint. But if you're
hmm
doing it from the standpoint of like occupational health, it feels like biomedical engineering is kind of like the perfect merger between those things.
I agree.
Yeah. So biomedical engineering schools, like, get involved.
Yeah, get involved. Tell your students that ergonomics is a
The-
valid career path
That's
after
right.
you graduate.
That's right.
I sure didn't know about it. Maybe it was in like the fine print or something, but I don't know. Biomedical engineering in general has changed a lot since either of us have been majors.
Mm.
So even between like when you graduated, when I graduated.
Yeah, there's a lot coming out. I think that in and of itself sort of describes like how the technology as it really accelerates year to year
hmm
um has a big influence on that, right?
Yeah.
Where, not to get into too much of this history, I guess, but the primary things that were always talked about for us was always like imaging and things of that nature
hmm
versus like this kind of applied space of biomedical engineering where you're maybe actually working with individuals. And that seems to be shifting, or at least they're giving more opportunities for those types of disciplines to those journeys to be gone down, basically.
Yeah, I think so.
Um, so I guess like as we continue to build these different tools, why do you think that we're even talking about ergonomics? Like, obviously, we've talked about how it involves human movement, and we have this experience sort of in the research labs. But like from your perspective, like what are you seeing out there in the field, and hearing from people that you talk to, why do you think that they need these tools, this technology?
I guess to me, it's an interesting question. Well, for one, it feels like the next step that makes sense. And again, technology isn't new to
Hmm.
ergonomics, but utilizing technology that is very accurate and precise to complete assessments and assist with product design feels like it's right up our alley just because at Neuraxon, at least, we're very heavily focused on creating these research grade, these precise, these accurate tools. Um, so it feels kind of like we're stepping into this space where it could be a very natural place for our users to be.
Hmm.
Um, and, kind of, it's very similar to how we align ourselves as a business as well, or we have customers that are researchers and we have customers that are, in the applied field, and ergonomists can be more research oriented and
Hmm.
they can be more like working in like the field oriented and just trying to make decisions right then and there. So I think we can learn a lot in terms of optimizing tools for research and like applicable like ease of use accessibility
Hmm.
from ergonomists because they have this kind of happy middle ground where they are focused on like, okay, we understand the quality, the accuracy has to be there, and we understand that what is needed to get there
Hmm.
in terms of standardization of data collection techniques and calibration techniques. Um, but we need this to be like accurate for 8 hours because
Yeah.
we have someone in the warehouse doing this job the whole day, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like not to keep beating a dead horse, I guess, but a lot of the same reasons that there's been this influx in using technology in, sort of day-to-day clinical medicine is maybe the same as like why there's more of an interest these days to adopt these tools in applied ergonomic space as well, where
Yeah.
both disciplines had people that sort of did their work in labs, created controlled conditions to run experiments to figure out, normative or reference ranges. And then those sort of influenced the tools that are then used practically, which, may be anything from like some of the assessments that you mentioned or surveys or any things that are going to kind of give you some data to work from, but don't actually require you to collect
Mm-hmm.
this movement information on the job, so to speak.
Yeah.
But as from our standpoint, right, like creating wireless sensors and creating software that allows for these workflows to be adopted and learned fairly quickly
Mm-hmm.
seems to have promoted this new era of like, let's see how far we can take it, right? And I think you mentioned something interesting in terms of like, there's definitely a difference in just like looking at a singular task and analyzing it from that perspective, and then maybe, interpolating the results outward,
Mm-hmm.
versus having the ability to like monitor somebody over their entire shift of work.
Yeah.
Um, and then use that information for, whatever purpose. But I think that that's like a really interesting space in ergonomics in general, is that there is a big interest in wanting to have both of those things,
Yeah.
to be able to kind of spot check and do these task analyses, if need be, kind of at a moment's
Mm-hmm.
notice. And then at the same time, like have technology and tools that are going to allow sort of like a hands-on or hands-off rather, monitoring situation.
Yeah.
But still get objective information, still have, this trackable history, whatever you
Mm-hmm.
want to call it. Um, and I think that's like a really exciting area for that space when it comes to more of the reactive ergonomics side of
Yes.
things.
Yeah.
Because maybe with the monitoring data, they're able to get pinged, when something happens, or vice versa. If somebody does get injured, now they've
Yeah.
got this history to be able to look at and see like, oh yeah, like, this worker was in these compromised positions, for far too long.
Mm-hmm.
We need to do something about it, right? And then maybe they go in and then they use the next level of technology to analyze it a bit more completely, and then they make decisions one way or another of how they're going to change that environment or that task or that workflow,
Yeah.
and then test again, right? And then you just kind of, they go hand in hand in a way.
Yeah.
um for the most part though, I haven't necessarily seen that in like a rehab type of space, but there isn't really, I don't know if there is a reason to even do that, like what would
Yeah.
you
I don't
monitor?
know. And that's the thing. Like it feels like for ergonomics, you can put these guide rails on something that you do over a long period of
Mhm.
time because like when you're doing something for a long period of time, it naturally has to be very, you have to be in an optimal position.
Yeah.
There's no way I'm going to be able to like hold 20 pounds this far away from my face for,
You're pretty
20
strong.
minutes.
I think you could do it.
Maybe. But
But yeah, that probably wouldn't pass the assessment, right? The risk assessment.
right. But it like ergonomics from that point of view, like if you're purely looking at how often are you in these risky positions versus these safe positions, feels very easy in a way because it's like, yeah, you throw some sensors on for 8 hours. That's the easy part is collecting all the data. And then you're not necessarily wholly focused on like when they're doing what, but just over the course of the whole period of time, as a percentage, how often are you in a high risk position versus a low risk position?
Mm,
And what body part was in that risky position, right? Like, are your shoulders being above your shoulder, your hands being above your shoulder height?
hmm.
Is that a risk scenario that needs to be mitigated?
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's, I mean, it's interesting because it feels so easy, right?
Right.
It feels like a no-brainer, but um, I think then the hard part is deciding how to design the device or the environment around that as
Mhm.
well, because you can't necessarily control everything.
Yeah.
Like you can learn a heck of a lot, yeah. And I think that's kind of a place that a lot of ergonomists are in. They're just like, yeah, we learned that these workers are doing this every day. It's like,
Right.
okay, well, what do we do? It's like, I don't know.
That's where the art really takes over, right?
Yeah, it
Is
does
like,
feel like an art,
yeah,
huh?
for sure. Yeah. And, whether that is like workspace design or,
Mm-hmm.
a new tool or, even these days, like exoskeletons and
Mm-hmm.
things that are affecting the worker and, giving them longer term performance and uh, those areas. But yeah, I think that that's really interesting to note is how these tools are used differently in those different kind of capacities and um, when the focus is on the workplace optimization and you do have to kind of take in all of these different variables. I mean, it's kind of wild to think that they even come up with a lot of these solutions because there are so many confounding factors that probably are not controllable.
Yeah.
Whereas, at least if somebody comes in and they had an injury, you can be like, well, what did you do?
Yes. Yeah.
And then they're like, oh, okay, like, yeah, that's, let's not have you do that anymore because that's,
Mm-hmm.
clearly a risky scenario. But doing it more proactively in a way, I think is definitely where that art kicks in for
Yeah.
sure. Um, you know, and certainly there's an art to the design of products and
Oh,
tools
in
and things
general,
like that,
yeah.
right? I mean, that's 100% an art form.
Yeah. But I think it is really interesting that the design of tools based on ergonomics and how a person interacts with that tool.
Hmm.
I think that's a very cool use of technology, whether that's motion capture or even EMG. Like, how much muscle activation are you using to press a button or
Hmm.
to, you know, if you're holding a tool in front of your body or at a slightly different angle away from your body, you know?
Yeah,
Like, I think that's an interesting application, is just as someone who does product design, kind of validating that your product is more ergonomic than someone else's product.
right. Did you, I mean, before working here, before sort of getting exposure to this world, so to speak, did you even have an understanding that like these types of measurements were even used in those designs? Like for instance, you mentioned like ergonomic mice. Um,
Ergonomic mice.
yeah, 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 right. Uh, but I guess from my perspective, it was like, okay, that was like a word attached to it, but I didn't necessarily think that there was a full scientific experiment run on how to make that thing ergonomic.
Totally. Yeah, I thought it was like a marketing gimmick.
Yeah,
I had no idea there was someone in the background, like a scientist, like doing these experiments to try
yeah,
to validate, like, okay, this design is better. And you can quantify what percentage better it is in
right.
some way, you know?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing like how much detail and focus goes into uh the design of, we can talk about consumer products, but um how they think about that because for some things like for instance like a computer keyboard, um from the base level, you're like, okay, like, you have some keys and it's on this flat keyboard and,
Yeah. Everyone
just
uses
it's
it.
a, yeah, you just like don't even think about it. But the reality of it is that somebody spent a significant amount of time looking at the slope of the keyboard, looking at like the distance between the keys, looking at, like you said, how much force or pressure it takes to press that key.
Hmm.
What does it feel like after they press it? Like, so that sort of level of product design is something that um, it was is really kind of cool to get exposed to
For
at that
sure.
level. Whereas before, working in this space, like it just never really occurred to me. And so totally seeing something like this ergonomic mouse uh felt like it was just like a marketing thing.
Yeah,
Um, and so it's so impressive to hear about the level of detail sometimes that these companies go through.
for sure.
Another one that's sort of popped up is in tool design and more so for like professional tools. Uh, and thinking about somebody who has to use that for hours on end, day to day,
Hmm.
and how they, these companies have to control for like where is like the trigger to, for to use this drill or this
Yeah.
blower or something like that. How much force or pressure does it require to actuate that? What's the vibration effects?
Yes.
And sort of how does that influence fatigue or their use, over time? It was just really cool to sort of see how all of that comes together. And I think that for me was like what really was the aha moment of like, oh, okay, now I get it from the standpoint of human movement analysis and
Hmm.
ergonomics. Like it's not just let's move these things around and more from like the basic standpoint of like, okay, don't lift, this much weight
Yeah.
and don't, put things too high up or, whatever. But it's like, no, it can go into this like excruciating level of detail,
Yeah,
which has long-term effects
for sure.
overall. So, yeah, I thought that was a really neat area to sort of get exposed to.
I think so too. It's also interesting like how aware you are of it when you interact with anything,
Hmm.
like where a button is. We've all interacted with some thing,
Hmm.
I don't know, where you've gone like, why'd they put the button there? That's so dumb, you
Yeah.
know? And so going like thinking about how with at least certain tools like professional tools, they do go through this rigorous validation process to like not just think about the human systems aspect of it, like psychologically, where would a person
Mm.
press the button,
Yeah.
but also like, okay, is it going to be efficient for that person to move their arm from here to here to use it? Or like talking about buttons, right? Are they going to be able to reach that button efficiently without hurting themselves if they're doing it a lot? But it's just funny to put those pieces together because it's like something you always kind of think about when you interact with stuff. Like when something isn't
Doesn't feel
pleasing to
right. Yeah.
interact with.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And then I think another area that sort of popped up that was, again, this sort of afterthought is, when we started working or getting exposure to some of like the car manufacturing stuff. And
Hmm.
of course, like you have an understanding that there are workers in these factories that are executing these jobs and building these cars, and they're doing so for, whatever, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hour shifts. Um, but again, it's like you don't actually think about like what they're having to do. And so, that there
Hmm.
is a worker who spends their entire day just installing this brake line on, countless number of vehicles over and over and over again. And they do
Yeah.
that every single day. And so that sort of repetitive task, I never really thought about what kind of toll that would actually take on the body before getting
Yeah.
exposed to this industry and understanding that there is such a high focus on um, how to ensure that that repetitive task doesn't injure this person.
Hmm.
And sometimes, like, in terms of the optimization of it, like there really isn't anything that you can actually do. Like the brake line has to be installed into the car. And, certain A, B, C type of order has to occur before that brake line can get installed. And so
Yeah.
you kind of have to work within the confines of that. So now you're entering into this other scenario where it's more of the systems engineering. And so you're like,
Yeah.
okay, how can we position this person? How many times should they install this brake line before, they have to take a rest or something like that. So
Right.
I just think that whole side of it has been another area that I just didn't ever think about. And then
Yeah.
now you get exposed to it, and now you have this new lens to kind of look at all of these different things, all of these products, all this the stuff that we interact with on a daily basis, and kind of
Yeah.
dig into those details or be curious about, what kind of control mechanisms, these different manufacturers might be using.
Yeah. I want to go off into not necessarily, maybe it's tangent,
Hmm.
but we'll see where it takes us. Um, like thinking about ergonomic design as like you're trying to design the task around the person or trying to design a way for a person to be in the right place to be able to form the task. What you don't hear about quite as often is educating the person
Hmm.
on how to perform the task more efficiently,
Hmm.
you know? Like
Yeah,
you're
like more of the
trying
training aspect of
exactly.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, or like, okay, you're doing this ta like I'm watching you do this task, you're getting hurt, but it's because you don't know how to lift correctly.
Sure.
Like how much of it is just retraining that person that's kind of like this half ergonomics, half physical therapy coaching approach, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, one of my favorite terms that I've heard in the industry, and forgive me because I don't know who coined it or if it's, trademarked anywhere,
Yeah.
but so shout
Maybe
out
we'll
to
find out.
whoever, yeah,
Shout out
whoever.
to whoever coined it.
Yeah, but the industrial athlete. I think that's
Oh,
like
okay.
a really neat term to think about with, these people that are doing these jobs, and
Hmm.
they're grueling, they're physical. It's,
Yeah,
it's very much the same principles that you would apply to a high-end athlete, where you're trying to
totally.
preserve their body and you're trying to build up their ability to move efficiently
Yes.
and execute to the highest level, right? And again, the stakes are different, right? But at the end of the day, like that's sort of the goal, is to ensure that this person thinks of themselves as like this athlete, like,
Yeah.
and their body needs to be tuned specifically to perform at the best of their abilities.
Yeah.
um, but I know that that was an initiative. I want to say it was like in the American College of Sports Medicine. Is maybe where
Interesting.
I saw it first. But anyways, it
Let's
was it
see.
was an initiative to essentially treat these workers as these high-end athletes and give them, all the training that would be necessary for them to perform at these high levels.
I
What do you?
Googled it and I didn't find
Yeah,
anything
well.
super. There's a theindustrialathlete.com. Shout out to them. Maybe. Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know.
Well,
Um,
in any case, I think
yeah.
it plays to what you were saying in terms of like, there's a training element to this that brings in maybe more of that the clinical background, let's say,
Yeah.
and the understanding of the human body and the way that it should be moving to kind of produce the results that you want safely and effectively,
Yeah.
versus just, well, let's just reorganize, how this environment is set up,
Right.
right? And
But that's kind of where ergonomics is focused, right? It's
sure,
all about like organizing the thing around the person,
yeah,
whether that's an object or a workplace design, rather than trying to figure out how the person can perform the task more efficiently with what they've got,
right.
you know?
Yeah, I wonder why maybe that's been the focus in the past, because I would argue that there's definitely a trend in the training. I mean, we've got a customer, Chris Hughes, who, like, that's kind of his entire business
Oh
model, is like
yeah, that's
going
kind of
around
his
and,
bread and
yeah,
butter.
creating training modules for people to learn how to lift.
But it feels like it's not that common. Like
Yeah.
it feels like he has this kind of unique, like sort of scenario with
Hmm.
his training as a physical therapist going
True.
into these ergonomics projects
Yeah. Yeah,
and
these
trying to,
facilities, yeah.
yeah. But talking about what you were saying earlier, like, okay, if this person is going to do this uh, many, many times for many, many hours, we have to be able to get them to think of themselves as an athlete. Um, but like a place where the stakes are really high, where like there's not much you can do is like surgeons, right?
Mm, yeah,
So
true.
exactly the same situation. They're in an operating room for hours
Hmm.
and hours and hours. They're bent over a table. Like, what can you do in that case? Like, you can make the table a little higher,
Yeah.
maybe. But like at the end of the day, like they can't necessarily be focused on how they're positioning their body because they're trying like their priority is the patient on the operating table.
Right. Well, and oftentimes they're not interchangeable.
No.
Whereas like in a manufacturing facility, the person installing the brake lines is also trained to then go install the brake pads or something
Hmm.
like that, right? And so they can switch jobs to sort of eliminate the fatigability in a
Yeah.
way, where that's not really going to be the case for a surgeon most of the time. It's like
No.
they're kind of the one. So they put their bodies on the line for sure. I think that's something that's is another area of exposure in this ergonomics world that seems like it's underserved in a way. I mean, again, I don't want to, just say call that out, but like it seems like it's relatively new that that's even really being looked at.
Yeah.
And from the most part, at least from what I've heard, sort of in talking with people, is that that is coming from the surgeons themselves.
Totally.
It's not people, it's not ergonomists going and talking to them and being like, hey, you
Mm-mm.
guys are kind of putting yourself at risk here. But it's the surgeons coming back and being like, I did this for 40 years and, my neck is done. Like I can't even turn my head, right?
Yeah, like what's that about? It
Yeah.
feels like such an obvious place to look when you're talking about like being in risky positions all day long and
Hmm.
over time. But I think, that's an interesting example where if you're working in a factory, you can't change everything, obviously, but there are things you can do to make that environment more efficient.
Hmm.
I don't know what you can do a lot of if you're like you find that your surgeon is in this awful position for his neck, right? Like maybe you can move the monitor he was looking at to the right all the time
Hmm.
to a different area, like things like that, right? But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, you're still hunched over someone for
Yeah,
for a long period of
you
time.
got to get in there, right?
Yeah. So that's where it's like, I don't know what I'm trying to get at. It's not like it feels helpless, but I think it's good that there's attention to it and there's
Sure.
research being done, but maybe I'm just not creative enough to think of like, yeah, you can measure that and you're gonna find out that it sucks, but like, what are you gonna do about it?
Well, I think in both cases, in the OR room or in the OR in these manufacturing facilities and material handling facilities, whatever it might be, it's sort of ripe for development.
For
For
sure.
where we're talking about, our sort of role in this is like the analysis side and basically exposing the risk
Hmm.
from an objective standpoint. But I think what it's bringing up is opportunity for other people to design and develop the solutions, right? And so,
Totally.
what we see, of course, in like the material handling side of things or in the manufacturing side are exoskeletons.
Hmm.
Maybe those are making their way into the OR. I don't know.
Maybe.
But, for instance, your sort of monitor scenario there that you mentioned, these augmented reality glasses, right? So like they can wear glasses and the monitors are here. So
Yeah,
everywhere they look, they're seeing the monitor, not
totally.
just, over here to the right, or left, I guess. But uh, and then, what tools are they using? Kind of similar stuff to what we were talking about from
Yeah,
the standpoint of the keyboards or the mice is like, where's the buttons? How am I supposed to hold this thing? Can I put it in a better position to where I'm not, engaging these same muscles constantly, or at least I can reduce that demand, let's say, on those particular muscle groups. And I think that's another exciting area for us to, as the manufacturers of these tools, like we get to we get to see some of those different areas that people
Hmm.
are starting to want to use the analysis to then make the solutions or verify or validate the solutions.
Yeah, we learn something new every day in terms of what people use our technology for.
Hmm.
And I think the fact that our involvement with like using the technology kind of stops at like the analysis point. Like, okay, you have the data. Here's a method you can use to sort of look at it, summarize it, let's say. But I think the reason I'm so fascinated with like, oh, I wonder what they do with it is just because like I don't, that's not really my role, you know? It's
Hmm.
like, I think it's so fascinating what people decide how to use this information to change something, you
Right.
know?
Yeah, and then like ultimate, like does it have an effect? Is it adopted?
Hmm.
And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see kind of how those things continue to change. Another area completely different to this, but is also incorporated within this kind of ergonomics, human factor side of things is like robotics
Yeah.
and to this like humanoid robotics, right? Like,
Yes.
because one sort of application area that we haven't mentioned yet, but is like the interaction between humans and robotic systems.
Hmm.
And so they're doing studies, they're doing analysis on how do we make that more natural? How do we make it more efficient? How do we optimize it?
Yeah,
And or create control mechanisms or something like that. And I think that that's another, really interesting space that we kind of get this like backdoor exposure to before it's, out in the world, so to speak.
yeah,
Um, but that's one that, we're keeping a close eye on for sure, just because there's clearly utility for our tools in that area.
for sure.
And so it's like, well, what's ultimately going to be the thing that becomes kind of part of the norm, you know, uh, when you can reach out and, shake a robot's hand or something like that, and
Yeah,
it doesn't crush your hand
right.
because it's been trained on, what does grip actually feel like? What does
Yeah,
that pressure actually feel like?
yeah,
So really interesting stuff. And I mean, there's a lot to sort of explore in a lot of these areas, but um, at the end of the day, it feels like this space of ergonomics and human factors almost is like as broad as just biomechanics in general. You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
where
I agree.
a lot of the rehab and clinical applications, like I don't want to say they're narrow, but it's relatively more focused on like the singular person and their individual capacity, whereas ergonomics seems to have this kind of like all these different specialty areas that
Yeah.
you can dive into. And
Well, it's
so
also rarely focused on an individual. It's focused
true,
on like
like the masses, yeah,
optimizing, yeah, for a group of
sure.
individuals, which, yeah, we can get into that. Like every
Whole nother
whole
ball
other
game,
thing,
yeah,
yeah.
definitely.
And that's where it can be more challenging to sort of come up with those guide rails because what might be risky for one person might not feel all that bad to the next person.
Right.
But that's where I think there's like this interesting sort of world in which, training could go a long way.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think that's just it's like you said, it's a whole different ball game once you're trying to design processes around like the masses rather than trying to tailor services or rehab programs to an individual.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, the short, stocky person is going to have a completely different experience than the tall, lanky person, right? And
Yeah.
so,
And
uh,
tall people tend to have more back problems too.
well, they gotta dip lower.
Yeah.
Um,
There's like I don't know, I think there's something out there that says tall people statistically don't live as long as short people.
wow. Sorry, tall people.
Sorry, tall people.
I mean, speaking of that then, so like, do you think that like a big focus is on sort of these long-term trends in this area? Like, is that kind of the primary analysis feature that they're looking at? Or do is there more of a focus on like maybe some of the short-term gains in terms of like being able to mitigate that risk profile like right away? Uh, and just curious, like from your perspective, having talked with a lot of these users, what seems to be the area of
Yeah,
focus primarily?
I think it's the long term, and I think it's for a few reasons. So the first one is that a lot of these organizations that are focused on workplace optimization and ergonomics, like they have liability.
Mm,
Like if their workers get injured on premises, guess who has to pay for that workman's comp situation?
mhm.
It's the business.
Right.
So liability is a big thing. Then I think like long-term safety is critical. And that, it could be short-term too. Like you just don't want someone to be in an unsafe position ever.
Hmm.
But also there's really high turnaround with some of these really grueling industrial jobs.
Sure.
And so people are like get injured and they retire. They can't do the job anymore, or it's just too much for them and they can't do it for a long period of time. And so I think with the cost of training and mostly training, right? Training that worker to do that task. Like you don't want to have to hire a new person every single year just because the job is too grueling.
Yeah.
So,
That's interesting. And an anecdote that I've heard is that there's been a more intense focus on like the long-term care and let's say durability
hmm.
of these industrial workers in more recent years because the workforce isn't there. There isn't necessarily people, lining up outside of the manufacturing facilities looking
Yeah.
for jobs.
Yeah, you're right. I think that's part of it too, is like these organizations don't want high turnover because there's not someone lining up
Yeah.
to get the job.
Right. Well, and so they need to preserve that trained person's, body and safety
Hmm.
so that they can have these, 10, 20, 50, however long career.
Right.
Um, because that's just there isn't that workforce available quite the same way that there was, in the early days, let's
Yeah.
say. So I thought that was really interesting because obviously it puts a focus on kind of why this industry is really becoming more popular, and you're seeing a lot more of an intense focus on the preservation and the safety of these workers. On one hand, you're like, why wasn't that always the case? Like it's kind of sad that
Yeah,
that
it
there was this
is.
sort of expendability, but
Yeah, not that many people want to
yeah,
be like factory workers, so I guess we got to take care of the people that do.
yeah, exactly. Uh, but it made a lot of sense when that was shared with me, and kind of eye-opening in a way to understand a little bit more about like, oh, okay, like these people need to be in positions to where they are safe and they're able to do these jobs effectively for much longer term periods than they had sort of initially intended them to be.
Yeah. Well, thank you
So
for sharing with the rest of us.
yeah, yeah, that's my anecdote there.
There you go.
Why I'm allowed one per episode.
No, it's a very
Um,
relevant anecdote.
yeah. So I mean, that said, I think, we touched a little bit on kind of the monitoring aspects. We touched a little bit on this, use of technology in the lab and in the non-lab environments. What do you think is our role as like a product developer in sort of creating these tools that are able to perform in these non-lab environments when, the conditions are not controlled and the consistency of the data collection is not available, per se?
I think our role is just to make the most robust product as possible when those things aren't like those types of measures aren't possible.
Hmm.
What would you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, to put it plainly for sure. You want to be sure that whatever you're creating can can withstand,
Yeah.
those different scenarios. I think this comes back to some of the points that we were talking about earlier in terms of like giving up accuracy for usability in
Mm-hmm.
a way. Um, one thing that kind of sticks with me that from one of our previous guests was talking about the the main thing that he looks for in like a device is like connectivity and like does it connect right away and stay
Yeah.
connected. And
Right.
I
That's like a bare minimum requirement.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And so like those sort of simple usability things don't necessarily have any effect on the accuracy necessarily, right? Like you just
Mm-hmm.
don't like they shouldn't be related, right? But I think our role in this space is really trying to understand like what are those kind of non-negotiable usability aspects.
Mm-hmm.
Some that come to mind kind of right off the bat are like, okay, can it perform for long durations?
Right.
Are the calibration workflows convenient? Do the sensors stay connected?
Yeah.
And do they connect readily? Um, and then I think you start to get into, some of the other more exciting spaces, at least for me, which is like on the software side in terms of like user interface design and data visualization and things of that nature. But that's where you're also getting sort of different experiences depending on what it is that you're trying to design for.
Sure.
Is like the monitoring type of data where it's like all day long, crazy amount of information. You're sort of looking at this trend of, risk positions or things like that. You're creating buckets, risk buckets. How you visualize that is going to be completely different than how you might visualize like a singular task analysis and, maybe
Totally.
looking at some of the more I don't know, raw data, let's say, around those things.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think like our role as product developers, manufacturers, like you hit the nail on the head when you said like we gotta listen to what those like non-negotiables are in
Mhm.
terms of how that product works and operates. But I think the other thing um, to consider is that our focus should also be on just educating people on
Mm,
what, like the users of our technology on what the limits of the technology are,
hmm
which we've touched on before as well, but it's just somebody could say to you, I need the product to be able to measure this in these scenarios, but we have to be able to come back if that's not possible and explain why.
Why? Yeah.
And explain, okay, if you want this to happen, here are the things that you're going to have to do, whether that's within the workflow, within the data analysis routine. So I think that's kind of an important stance to take as well, because it's, varying people, varying levels of education in one way or another, familiarity with the technology, interact with the products that we make. And so just making them as accessible as possible in terms of like ease of use, but also people should know how to use them
Mm.
to get the best data possible.
So maybe there's some concessions on both sides. Like
I think so.
we've got to concede a couple things and maybe kind of understand what the good enough range is
hmm
and design and develop for that. But then on the other side, maybe there's concessions about, well, what's actually possible with the technology that you're given
Right.
and your expectations. Yeah, interesting conversations. Those are, I mean, I guess that's what drives innovation, right? Is
Yeah.
trying to solve those problems and create the bridge between those two things.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Next time
Camera's
we gotta
dying
be prepared on
on all
all
batteries. Yeah,
batteries.
it
Okay.
went quick.
Yeah.
It's optimized for performance.
It's optimized for performance and not power efficiency.
Well, I think that, we've covered a lot of ground in our conversation today. And, clearly this is like a really exciting field and something that's relatively new for us, you and I personally, and definitely a space where there's like a lot of solutions
Yeah.
to be had. And not only, from our standpoint, from the analysis and measurement standpoint, but as we talked about, like what are the solutions to then address the problems that are uncovered?
Yeah. I'm
Um,
excited to just keep learning from professionals in the ergonomics industry on like what those non-negotiables are for them, like what their needs are,
mhm.
because I think like overall I like learning about exactly what those are and make sure that we're bringing to the table what we need to bring.
Yeah, and then you can keep analyzing the different products that you're interacting with too,
Yeah.
right? And be like, oh yeah, let me think about this. This key feels nice when I press it and it's in a great position.
Yeah.
So, um, well, that said, I think that that's probably a good place for us to end for today.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on this journey with
Yeah,
us. It's been uh touching on a couple of different things, but hopefully everyone stuck around.
that's right. And make sure you subscribe and like our podcasts on all your different platforms and follow us on social media at
All right.
InterAxonUSA. And we will see you next time.